Okay, so we have, in addition to our last three speakers, we have three additional panelists. And I invite them to go ahead and introduce themselves and present their slide. We'll start from the far end.
I'm Judy Regensteiner, Distinguished Professor of Medicine at the University of Colorado, Director of the Center for Women's Health Research there.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'm Nanette Santoro, Professor and E. Stewart Taylor, Chair of OBGYN at the University of Colorado School of Medicine.
I'm Ursula Kaiser. I'm an endocrinologist at Harvard Medical School and Brigham and Women's Hospital. I'm the chief of the endocrine division there and professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. And my research interest is on the neuroendocrine regulation of reproduction.
The slide shows women's health across the lifespan, starting with in utero and going to old age, and including life course events such as childbirth, menopause, and aging. And so it helps encourage us to think about women's lives across the lifespan and the hormonal changes that take place within the lifespan, and gives us a framework by which to study women's health. The other considerations in the slide are those of sex, which are the biological influences, including genetics, hormones in some part, and other biological aspects of women's health. And then there are also the considerations of gender, which are more the psychosocial aspects. So when we think about studying women's health, we have to think about the changes in hormone that accrue across the lifespan. And it's very much a continuum. It's not that girls do not suddenly become women. So we have to think about all these considerations. And there's the slide. I can see it, but you can't see it. The elusive slide, I will call it.
Oh my gosh.
There it is.
That's part of it.
Part of it.
One more.
So thinking about women's health across the lifespan helps us think about the hormonal influences as well as the myriad other influences. So studying women's health isn't easy, but we still need to do it.
Okay.
And it's the most interesting thing. Anyway.
Okay, thank you. If we could have the slide for Dr. Santoro.
So we have told ourselves a story about what happens during menopause, and as someone who's a clinician who takes care of patients who are menopausal, I very often will see patients who describe exactly what was my own lived experience as well, which is that it seems to get very easy to gain weight and very, very hard to lose weight from sort of the mid-40s onwards. It's a whole new ballgame, and the strategies that worked for younger women don't work as well. Women aren't sleeping as well. There's a bunch of other things that seem to be working, and for many years we've been living with the story that resting energy expenditure goes down, and that this is somehow magic happens, and this is linked to hormones. And whenever we think about hormones in menopause, we tend to tie it to estrogen, which may or may not be correct. And then this paper by Ponser et al. Came out in Science in the summer and drove me and several of my junior colleagues completely nuts, because it turned on its ear everything that we thought was true. So if this is adjusted total energy expenditure and adjusted basal energy expenditure on the top and bottom here, looking through age, and these are all of the studies that were put together using doubly labeled water to determine energy. So thought to be one of the most accurate ways that you can do it. And you can see that there's a bump in childhood. It goes down a bit in adolescence, but between the ages of 20 and 60, men and women that are both shown on this slide are pretty much neck and neck in terms of total and basal energy expenditure. So myself, Kara Marlad, who's at Pennington Research Institute, Annie Caldwell, and Vicki Catenacci in Colorado, have actually requested the data, because we want to go back and look at it in association with what may be known about the women in terms of their final menstrual period, because even though this is several hundred studies, it's not, each individual age range could be pretty small in what the representation is. So we want to look at this again and see, can we actually see an inflection? But you can see just from looking at it that that seems kind of unlikely. So it's often the thing that puzzles you the most and confounds you the most and goes against what you're currently thinking that leads the field forward. So I thought I would share this slide with you all today.
Great, thank you. Okay, and if we could have the next slide for Dr. Kaiser.
So, if we can just start with that half. So I thought that I would be a little bit provocative and give you a brain-centric view of metabolism and reproduction and say that the brain is the master of all of these functions. And particularly to hone in and say the kisspeptin neuron is the master of these functions. So many of you may know, may be familiar with the kisspeptin neuron, which was discovered about close to 2 decades ago now as a neuron that sits above the GnRH neuron and activates the HPG axis during puberty and modulates the activity of the axis throughout the lifespan and mediates positive and negative feedback of sex steroids, for example. And so we know that these neurons secrete a neuropeptide called kisspeptin that activates GnRH neurons. And they, in turn, are regulated by other upstream signals, such as, for example, energy balance. So they are very attuned to energy balance, and when energy balance is negative, through the various signals that signal energy balance, as we heard about from Professor Mansoro's leptin as an example, the kisspeptin neurons will become quiescent. And so really this is a mechanism whereby the energy homeostasis will tell the body this is a good time to reproduce or not a good time to reproduce. And so it makes a lot of evolutionary sense that in a time of negative energy balance, you are not focused on reproducing. And so then if we can just add the next panel to the slide, on the right, if you can click one time. The other side of that is what's now also emerging is that the kisspeptin neurons themselves, in addition to activating the reproductive axis, they inhibit the energy homeostasis. So they actually do so not so much by food intake, but by energy expenditure. So that when you're in a situation of negative energy balance, you not only do the kisspeptin neurons suppress the reproductive axis, but they also increase the desire to preserve energy. So they increase energy preservation. So they're both a response to energy balance and a trigger of modulating energy balance. And they both respond to reproductive function and are a regulator of reproductive function. So you could sort of propose that the kisspeptin neuron evolutionarily tells the body whether it should be or tells the homeostatic systems whether it should be focusing on preserving energy or reproducing, depending on the energy balance, energy environment. So happy to talk more about that, and it ties in very well with some of the things that Professor Mansoros was talking about.
Great. Do we know if the other panelist has joined us yet, Dr. Mansoro? So we'll continue. I have a question for all of you, as well as I'll open the floor for anybody who wants to jump in with questions. But the panel discussion here is hormones and metabolism. What can we change? So we've had a number of different topics, and I'd like to know what you think sort of globally and maybe personally that we could change to improve metabolism and the hormone and the balance, the chemicals. So whichever one of you would like to start.
Well, I mean, again, I don't work on hormonal stuff, so I don't think I can comment so intelligently on any of that. I should say for the things I spoke about, for improving sort of quality control, things that are linked to metabolism. I mean, I think, for the processes we're interested, like autophagy, the things that unfortunately stimulate those things are like starvation and exercise. So those are the things that, you know, are universally thought to be beneficial, and they probably have benefits in many through various physiological pathways, but at least the pathways we're interested in, they're the classic stimuli for those sort of things. And so, I think we can tell people to eat less and exercise more, and they'll generally be healthier. But I think people hear that and it sort of goes over their head. So I'm not sure that that's, you know, advice that's always taken.
Okay.
I think, first of all, I would like there to be different advice so that we can. I love the exercise part, the eating less, that always keeps emerging. Most of my work is more in the vascular realm than in the hormonal, but I've become fascinated with seeing the changes that women experience, in particular, over the lifespan, which was what I was trying to show. And in a way, we know very little about how that works, and in a way, we're learning more. But it's a continuum. It's not discrete stages. So I'm just trying to think about how to study women's health. It's sort of, I co-chaired a session also with Dr. Sadovsky at the NIH on advancing the health of women, and it became clear to me how complex all the issues were when you try to study women's health, and yet saying it's complex. You know, I once was a reviewer for an NIH grant at another site, another state, where the guy wrote a grant on looking at risk factors in 450 men, cardiovascular risk factors. This was a few years ago, and so why aren't you studying women? He said, well, they're so complicated. And I personally, it's, you know, in a way true, but it's also stupid because women are 51% of the population. So we really have to think about it in a more sophisticated way than that. Be proud to be complicated. I don't know.
But, you know, we're not only complicated, men are complicated too. So,
In different ways. Right.
there you go. One of the ways that we must learn more is to go, we always think about pregnancy as a susceptible period and then looking at what's happening in the children. We are now beginning to look back and see what's happening, how changes, whether it's environmental exposures, happen in the grandmoms particularly, and grandfathers when you look at pesticide exposure, and how that impacts the mother already starting negatively, and then the impact on the child. A second way that we're looking at this is a broader, and you know, if I can accomplish anything today, is please look broader at how the environment is impacting our health. It's not only that physical environment, the way we are here. You know, when I ask kids, I'm saying, well, did you breathe today? Are you breathing while you're in here? Do you know what the quality of the air is? But also in the environment that we define as social, as political, as psychosocial, as economical. And so how all of that impacts not only our metabolism, the food we can afford to eat, the quality of the food. I haven't talked about climate and health yet, but it's real right here in Pittsburgh and in the surrounding areas where we have both fracking and cracking occurring, and the impact of that on women's health. And so looking at the environment broader than what we typically define as the physical environment is so critical. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would say that I have two main messages. Are there any Kurt Vonnegut fans in the audience?
Yeah.
So if you all know about the Trifalmadorans, they were the characters, they were the species from the Sirens of Titan, who when you saw them throughout their lifespan. They were like a giant sort of worm, like they carried their entire history with them. And I think that is what we do. And to understand women's health, if you don't look at that life course approach, you're going to miss important things. And we have been stuck, especially in menopause world, with sort of an obsession about estrogen. You know, estrogen was there, it's gone, and anything that changes after menopause has to be due to that. But the interactions are really complex. And if we don't view the woman as a Trifalmadoran, and it may even be intergenerational Trifalmadorans, because we now have data that, you know, we have transgenerational transmission of metabolic challenges that go even beyond the F2 generation. if you insult the organism badly enough, we're just going to keep missing the point. So those would be my 2 points to make.
And so I guess I'll stick with my theme of the brain and say that we could potentially target some of the pathways in the brain that are mediating the appetite and the desire for food, and maybe even more importantly, is the energy output and energy utilization, to try to increase that. And as we think about postmenopausal women and the decline in energy utilization that was seen, we could potentially try to target that centrally. But targeting the brain is not necessarily easy, so I think there would also be ways to target, so for example, brown fat, which is emerging as such an important area, and we could potentially target that to increase energy utilization.
Great. I see we have participants ready to ask questions. Dr. Janowitz?
Yeah, so I was curious, when you were thinking about that inflection point, you were talking mostly about menopause, but there was a second one, which was actually right around a woman at the age of 20. There's the very early one, and then there was another one where it leveled off around the age of 20. And I couldn't help but think that that also corresponds with peak reproduction and this continuum. And so I was just wondering if a couple of the speakers could address sort of that particular transition.
Yeah, I mean, there were really 2 inflections there. I mean, there was the childhood one, and then you saw the one around age 20. And 20 to 60, it looks pretty boring. It's pretty stable. And then it starts to drop again after 60. So, possibly we're seeing something, I don't think it didn't seem dramatic enough to me, because peak reproduction really is sort of mid-20s, early to mid-20s, biologically. And then if you look more in a psychosocial model, it's closer to the mid to late 20s, where it stays pretty stable, and then it begins to decline. So I don't know that I can comment further.
I should add, though, from a global perspective, that peak reproductive age is different in lower and middle income countries. And so when I had to go to the IRB and say I need to lower the inclusion criteria to 16, they thought I had lost my mind. But I had to, otherwise I would have missed 90% of the study population.
Yeah, it would be really interesting to look at that change, or that inflection point in that population.
Correct, and while you expect to have adverse birth outcomes, and we did see that, prematurity, low birth weight, low APGAR score, we should not forget what's happening in the woman who's 16.
Excuse me. I tried to shut off my microphone. Sorry about that.
I think the other thing that's a little interesting, I mean, the data you show is fascinating and sort of counterintuitive. But I think one thing that's sort of interesting, and it's hard to get at with that technology, is they sort of look at total energy expenditure, and there's no change. But one thing that I've always been very interested in, and I don't know how to do this on an organismal level, is how you partition energy. So I mean, what the total amount that you use may not change, but how you, as for instance, you say, reproduction versus other things, what choices you make with sort of the energy you have is also very important. And you can't really get that from the sort of total pie. But I think, from people who work on aging, you spend a lot of energy sort of repairing things, and you spend a lot of energy making things. And that balance is very important. What you taking care of what you have versus making new things.
And I think it's an important point. Those are all the sorts of things we're batting around. It's like, where should we look next?
Right, yeah.
If this is true, we've been conceptualizing this wrong.
But so the pie may not change, but how you distribute that might change dramatically at menopause. And that's harder to get at with double the light water, but still, in that data, there might be clues.
Dr. Monzero said he had emergency come up, so he's not able to join us, and he apologizes, but looks to forward future interactions. Your question.
Hi, my name is Jed Friedman, and I'm from the University of Oklahoma, formerly
from Colorado.
In Colorado. Hello, Nanette. Hello, Judy. It's good to see your face. And this is a great panel of some experts and some specialists. So I run a diabetes center where I'm actually focusing on women's health in the first 1,000 days. And I'm really intrigued by some of these topics. I want to ask you about a couple of hot topics, get your opinion. I'll ask Torin first, because I follow the aging field because it's a big center where I am as well. But the issue about using mTOR inhibitors in humans, like rapamycin, that really, works great in mice, not so much capable in humans. But something that's been brought to my attention are something called senolytics. And I was wondering if you might comment on that topic. And then I will ask Dr. Kaiser about something that Chris talked about and mentioned. Besides leptin, there is a hot paper that just came out last week about follistatin being a predictor of diabetes even before it starts. So just give me a couple of thoughts, and I'd like to hear from you what you think.
Sure. So senolytics are this idea that as we get older, we accumulate senescent cells. So these are cells that have been damaged and they've withdrawn from the cell cycle, and so they don't proliferate, but they, in the sort of medieval terms, secrete evil humors. And so the idea would be that because they do so, they can influence the surrounding cells around them and actually have far-reaching effects that sort of mediate age-related diseases. So rather than being I think most people thought they may exist, but since they don't proliferate, they aren't harmful. And I think there's a growing appreciation that they might be harmful because of what they secrete and how they change the local and distal milieu. So, and the idea of a senolytic is sort of like a chemotherapeutic. It's the idea that you can get a small molecule that would preferentially kill the senescent cell and leave the normal cell intact, much like you would kill the cancer cell but leave the normal cell also intact. And so again, in mice, everything works. We can make mice live forever. But the question is, will this be translatable to humans? I should say that, here at Pitt, the NIH just awarded $150 million to map senescence in humans, and we at Pitt got one of those mapping sites. So we're going to map human senescence in heart and lung tissues here with some neighboring universities, and other universities are going to be mapping senescent cells in human tissues in other organs, because it's not entirely clear to what degree these really accumulate in humans or not. And so that's sort of the purpose of this large NIH Common Fund project that just started a few weeks ago, and it's going to go on for 5 years. And if that's true, and they do accumulate and they are linked with physiological decline, it may make sense to sort of target them. But the key will be, can you really develop agents that are really selective for senescent cells that don't, just like the problem with chemotherapy, but even there, you have a lot to deal with, because there's a lot of things that kill dividing cells that wouldn't kill non-dividing cells. Here, you have to kill non-dividing cells without affecting other non-dividing cells and proliferating cells. So it's going to be a challenge, I think, to get drugs that really work. There are some that are out there already that have been repurposed from oncology, but they have lots of side effects. And I don't think they're really, in this population that are old and frail, whether, giving sort of repurposed oncological agents is going to be that well tolerated or successful. So
if you Google it, there are probably a dozen on the market.
Yeah, people want to live longer and healthier, so there's a lot of products being sold. Buyer beware.
I have a quick question for Dr. Finkel. You described autophagy, which functions at the organelle level in the cell. Do you see similar changes in ubiquitination at a molecular level?
Yeah. So there, as you get older, there is really there's a decline in the you're talking about the ubiquitin proteasomal system, which is how you deal with sort of mostly soluble proteins. So yes, there's a decline in that function. And then for larger structures or larger protein aggregates, that's usually handled by autophagy. There's a decline in that process as well. So both systems appear to decline. They handle slightly different things. They try to compensate for each other, but they have different tasks in the cell. But unfortunately, as you get older, both of them seem to go down in their activity, which yeah.
Each of the processes that is studied by our panel, Melissa, somehow influences aging. So the environment is a factor, exercise, of course, is a factor, different hormones at different times, and even reproductive neurodevelopment, they all can affect aging. And Torin, you pointed out, you illustrated to us different pathways, autophagy and TFEB activity that may potentially regulate aging. So I wonder, maybe Torin, you can start, but any other panelists, can you actually tie mechanistically any of the influences that your panelist neighbors are studying to TFEB or to autophagy?
Well, I just learned what they're doing. So, I mean, certainly, hunger and brain sensing of hunger, those are all intricately linked to autophagy. And classically, autophagy was described in yeast, and the person who described it won the Nobel Prize, I think, 2016 or 18 or something. And the classic stimuli there was starvation. So certainly, physiologically, when you don't eat, you stimulate autophagy, you stimulate TFEB to go to the nucleus, you stimulate all these processes. And so that's why, although it's painful, maybe not eating as much is probably good for you, because I think you do stimulate these processes of repair, and with repair comes the ability, I think, to withstand stress, and with that comes the ability potentially to live healthier. That's a very simplistic thing, but I certainly think, perception of hunger and actual hunger itself are really strong drivers of all the processes I talked about.
I want to ask
How
you.
about other factors, sex hormones and others that have been mentioned?
I don't know the literature that well on sex hormones and autophagy. I just don't know offhand whether or not they do.
Yeah, I mean, the links to the inhibin axis that Dr. Mansouris brought up, and clearly that, Ursula, that you work on and Dr. Kaiser works on, they are related to reproductive problems. I mean, the follistatin gene is one of the few genes that showed up in the GWAS studies of polycystic ovary syndrome. So that was pretty early on. And we don't have a lot of other, single genes that we can point to there. So they're influencing that axis. Activin antibodies now look like they, in a clinical trial, are changing fat mass and lean body mass. It's pretty remarkable how members of that ovarian, we always think of them as ovarian, but they're not. They may not be.
From a population-based perspective, something interesting is happening in the last 5 to 10 years in lower and middle income countries, where women were dying from infectious diseases. Women are now dying from non-communicable diseases because the economy has gone up, for example, because of gold mining and oil discovery. And so a McDonald's hamburger is much more preserved than a yuca pita. And so we're having a different kind of phenomenon happening. Although longevity and aging should increase, all of a sudden it's now decreasing for a different reason.
We have more time?
Yeah, we got some more time.
I've been interested in type 2 diabetes, which is what I studied, cardiovascular consequences
Yeah.
of type 2 diabetes. But in a lot of ways, diabetes represents like an early aging.
Yeah.
It behaves like
Yeah.
that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, the clinical sort of thing is like, people's blood vessels age, twice, so yeah, I mean, I think this, I think nutrient excess, drives a lot of processes. Obviously it suppresses autophagy, which we're interested, but it's, I think it's much more complicated than that. And so, I do think that, I don't think aging is, I don't think your tissues age at, equal rates, basically. And so I think certain diseases push you to age in certain compartments different than others. And I didn't bring this up in that mouse. The reason that mouse model was of interest to the press was because what we observed was that we made the mice live longer, and we protected many compartments by manipulating mTOR, so the brain was better. But there were other compartments like bone, and those mice got more cataracts. And so there were things that got worse or didn't get better at all. So, a single pathway can regulate, certain things about aging, but it doesn't, I don't think tissues age, within your same body can age at different rates, basically, and diseases can shift that as well.
Anyone else want to comment on that question? No? Okay, we have another question.
Thanks for a great panel, and I love the discourse. So I want to hone in on activity particularly. I think this topic of metabolism, as you all have illuminated, is so profound and fundamental. And it turns out weight is really important to women. But I wonder your thoughts about sort of activity and exercise as kind of this healthy stressor and its impact on some of the processes that you all think a lot about.
Yeah, I mean, well, we talked about it a little bit last night.
Right.
If you can't reduce fatness, fitness is not a bad second choice, but it probably takes both. And when you look at the literature on people actually voluntarily losing weight, it's always calorie restriction wins always over exercise, either because it makes you eat more or it just doesn't. You just got to do so much of it that you can't really use that as your sole strategy. But there's clearly numerous benefits.
And yet we still have trouble getting people to be active at all. Most Americans, vast majority, are sedentary, don't even exercise once a week. So that, to me, is at one end, we have to get people moving. And then there's a frustrating thing that as you get older, this is another unfairness, a biological unfairness, that you have to exercise more, and it doesn't help you lose weight like it used to. I mean, you don't lose weight just exercising, you have to diet as well. But it seems to get harder, and that is unfair.
So I wanted to just comment on that because I think it's really your basal metabolic rate is so much, has so much more influence on your total sort of calorie expenditure per 24 hours than exercise does. And so if there's a decline in your resting energy utilization or your basal metabolic rate with age or with hormone status or whatever it might be, exercise on top of that is going to seem like it's not working as well because it's a small amount compared to the basal rate. So I think potentially targeting basal energy expenditure might be a better target. Not that fitness doesn't have other benefits on, say, cardiovascular health and other things, but in terms of weight, that may not be the first target.
2 years ago, when I took students into the Amazon rainforest, we were walking for 90 minutes one way and walking back. The last time I went, there was a four-wheeler bringing gold miners to their area of work.
Okay, over here first.
So I want to throw a little more complexity to an already complex conversation and take what Ursula was just saying and add the complexity of, we're talking about weight, which is a unit of an organism, but if we actually look, which we all know to be true, anybody who's transitioned through sort of the perimenopausal state, that a depot is not a depot is not a depot. And so I wasn't sure, I mean, we're getting a little granular here, but if we wanted to sort of think about that as it relates to what Nanette said about some things are hormone related, a lot of things aren't. And so how do we think about sort of the leptin circuitry and then the reproductive axis and then why depots here and not depots there, and as it looks at the whole organism, and then how that might relate to disease risk. Putting on adipose tissue in some places is different than putting it on in others, and for diabetes risk, what Judy was talking about.
Yeah, it's a great point, Tracy, and I think it's really very complex, and so I think there are other contributors. So I think some of the things that we've talked about are net energy balance that don't necessarily impact where the fat tissue goes, and so I think we still have a long way to go to understand why it goes to certain places and even why some is healthier or less healthy than others. I don't know if anyone has any more insights into that.
Well, Wendy Court in Colorado has some evidence that your adipocyte lineage may also change, and that may be hormonally related. So that also speaks to some of the brown fat, white fat issues, but also if your adipocytes actually are bone marrow derived, they may be more malignant in phenotype. Those tend to go to the viscera. And one of the things we've learned in the SWAN study is that everybody who goes through menopause will put on an inch or two of sub-Q fat around their waist, and that is just about universal. It doesn't matter what weight you started at, but that is much less malignant in a fat deposition. So looking at, it's not just where it goes, it's really what it is. I don't think we fully understand.
But sorry, I did want to also just add that I'm sure genetics plays a component in this as well.
1 second.
Hi.
Okay. I just have one online question, a virtual question. Can you speak to how women who diverge from the traditional hormone life cycle, such as those that experience early menopause because of surgery or disease, differ in your work from those who naturally experience menopause?
Yeah, I mean, there's a literature out there that when you dig into it, it's scantier than you would think. That implies that it's more severe if you have early or surgical menopause. It's certainly more sudden if it's surgical, but it does look like women that have early menopause based on some limited data have prolonged symptoms that may be a little bit different and broader. But metabolically, they don't seem to be remarkably worse off. This is different and goes back to Dr. Mansouras's comment that mice are not humans, because in animals, variectomized animals gain weight and they have appetite dysregulation, they gain a ton of weight. You give them estrogen and it's an appetite suppressant. That doesn't seem to work so well for humans.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, this is Shuman Paul from Kansas. As I have a kind of multiple questions together. As we are talking about aging, I think we need to think about few aspects like DNA repair, epigenomic changes, telomerase shortening, and circadian rhythm. So how do you think that these hormones and metabolic aspect, especially in the context of women with aging, can affect these few things like DNA repair, epigenome, telomerase shortening, or the circadian rhythm? I would love to hear your comments about that.
It's a hard afternoon here. So, as you rightly point out, and what you've listed are what people generally ascribe to what are called the hallmarks of aging, of which, depending on who you talk to, there are 8 or 10 things that people associate with the aging process, and it's generally depicted as a circle with these various things affecting aging. And so, and that sort of, unfortunately, is the limit of our understanding at this point, because as opposed to many disease processes or physiological processes, the sort of epistatic relationship between those processes are not known. It's not clear how a decline in mitochondrial function relates to impairment in DNA repair versus telomere shortening. All of these things have been linked to how we age and are associated with how we age, but how they relate to each other, or even more complexly, as you ask, how they relate to things like estrogens availability or hormones, it's just not, at this point, there's no clear framework to incorporate that in. So I suppose there's work on each of those things, but I don't know to any way that I can provide a conceptual framework where I can say, that a change in the hormonal milieu is primarily affecting DNA repair capacity or mitochondrial function or telomere shortening. I don't think any of that is really clear at this point, nor is it clear how all those disparate hallmarks intersect and relate, and what is on top and what's on bottom, or does it change for different individuals. So the good thing about the field is that 20 years ago, aging was not even thought to be something you could study in a sort of reductionist way, that you couldn't even begin to it was just thought to be a random stochastic thing that didn't have any sort of framework to it. And we've made considerable progress, I would say, but I still think that it's the least understood physiological process. Probably the one that we're most concerned about as we get older, but it's unfortunately, as opposed to things like heart disease or diabetes or cancer, where I think there is some sort of conceptual framework about what's driving the process. I think here we're left with a circle that has really no beginning or end, but clearly some very interesting diagonals at this point.
Yeah, I mean, there's one model that sort of plays with circadian rhythm a little bit that Hadeen Joffe has developed at Harvard, where she gives younger women a GnRH agonist, wipes out their hormones, reproduces a menopausal type state with disruption of sleep, hot flashes, and she looks at mood, and mood deteriorates in women that are given a GnRH agonist, and before their mood improves, their sleep improves. So you can look at some of these things perhaps in relation to time, and once you see, so the circadian disruption may precede the mood disruption, may precede some of the metabolic things that we see.
I'll actually add to that because I'm collaborating with Hadeen on that project, and we're looking at cortisol across that, and you can see that there are disruptions of the normal circadian rhythms of cortisol, and we know that cortisol has a lot of metabolic effects.
So please help me thank the panelists for a very robust discussion.
Very nice to meet you.